Everyone walked past the lost old woman standing in the rain, until a homeless man stopped to help her. What seemed like a simple act of kindness was about to become the most life-changing moment of his entire existence. Daniel, a man who had nothing left except his loyal dog Scout, saw what everyone else ignored: a fragile woman whispering names under her breath, completely lost and alone. While strangers hurried past with their umbrellas, assuming she was just another vagrant, Daniel did something extraordinary. He shared half his sandwich with her and refused to walk away. But when the police arrested him, convinced he was exploiting this vulnerable woman, Daniel thought his one good deed had destroyed him forever. Little did anyone know, this wasn't just any lost old woman wandering the streets. She was Margaret Harrington, mother of billionaire real estate magnate Michael Harrington, and her son had been desperately searching for her. The homeless man, who had nothing, had just saved the mother of one of the most powerful men in the city. But here's the question that will leave you speechless. When a billionaire discovers that the one person who showed his mother true dignity was a man society had completely forgotten, what happens next? Too many stories like this go unheard. But by subscribing, you can make sure they're not forgotten. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. The rain fell in heavy sheets across the downtown intersection, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected the neon signs and headlights of the evening rush. Pedestrians hurried past with their umbrellas angled against the wind, faces buried in their phones or turned away from the weather, each person wrapped in their own urgent bubble of destination and purpose. In the middle of this human river stood Margaret Harrington, though she couldn't remember her own name at that moment. Her gray coat hung unevenly on her slight frame, one button missing, the collar turned up at an odd angle. Her handbag gaped open, revealing tissues and loose change that threatened to spill onto the wet pavement with each gust of wind. She stood perfectly still while chaos flowed around her, her pale blue eyes distant and unfocused, lips moving in silent conversation with ghosts only she could see. "Michael," she whispered to the rain. "Where is Michael?" The name felt familiar on her tongue, like a song she'd once known by heart but could no longer quite remember the melody to. She touched her temple with trembling fingers, trying to catch the thoughts that slipped away like water through a sieve. A businessman in an expensive overcoat glanced at her as he passed, his stride faltering for just a moment. He took in her mismatched appearance, the confusion written across her weathered face, and his expression shifted from curiosity to uncomfortable assumption. Dementia, perhaps, or worse. He quickened his pace, pulling out his phone to avoid making eye contact. A young mother pushing a stroller approached from the opposite direction. The child inside pointed toward Margaret with innocent curiosity, but the mother quickly turned the stroller away, whispering something about not staring at strangers. They disappeared into the crowd as quickly as they'd appeared. More people passed. A teenager with earbuds, a group of office workers sharing an umbrella, an elderly man with a cane. Each one saw Margaret standing there. Each one processed what they observed, and each one made the same calculation. Not my problem, not my responsibility, someone else will handle it. The city had taught them well. Across the street, beneath the awning of a closed storefront, Daniel Reyes sat on a piece of cardboard that had long since lost its battle against the dampness. His weathered hands rested on the head of Scout, a mutt of indeterminate breeding whose mismatched coat of brown and white patches told its own story of survival. Daniel's clothes were clean but worn, his beard neatly trimmed despite his circumstances, and his dark eyes held the kind of steady awareness that came from years of watching the world from its margins. Scout's ears perked up first, a low whine escaping his throat as he focused on something across the street. Daniel followed the dog's gaze and saw her, the old woman standing motionless in the rain, like a lighthouse forgotten by ships that no longer needed its guidance. "You see her too, boy?" Daniel murmured, running his hand along Scout's back. The dog pressed closer to his side, but his attention remained fixed on the woman. There was something in Scout's posture that Daniel recognized. The same alertness the dog showed when he sensed danger or distress that others missed. Daniel watched as person after person passed by the woman without stopping. He could read their faces even from this distance, could see the moment when awareness shifted to avoidance. He'd seen that same expression directed at him countless times, the look that reduced a human being to a problem to be avoided rather than a person to be acknowledged. The woman took a small, uncertain step forward, then stopped. Her mouth was moving again, and even from across the street, Daniel could see the distress in her posture. She was lost, truly lost, in a way that went deeper than simply not knowing which direction to walk. Scout whined again, more urgently this time, and tried to pull Daniel to his feet. The dog had always been a better judge of character than most people Daniel had known, and right now Scout was telling him something important. All right, Daniel said softly, gathering himself up from the cardboard. His joints protested the movement. 47 years old. But the streets had aged him in dog years. But he pushed through the stiffness. Scout trotted beside him as they waited for a break in traffic. As they crossed the street, Daniel could see the woman more clearly. She was small and delicate, with silver hair that had once been carefully styled, but now hung in damp strands around her face. Her clothes, though mismatched and disheveled, were of good quality, the kind of fabrics that spoke of a life very different from the one that had brought her to this corner. She was whispering names now. He could hear her as they approached. Michael. Where is Michael? The house. The garden. Her voice carried the particular confusion of someone whose mind was caught between past and present, between what was real and what was remembered. Daniel stopped a few feet away, Scout sitting obediently at his side. He'd learned long ago that approaching slowly was the key to not frightening people who were already scared or confused. Ma'am? He said gently, his voice carrying the careful respect of someone who understood what it meant to be invisible. Are you all right? She turned toward him, her blue eyes focusing with effort. For a moment, Daniel saw past the confusion to something else. Intelligence, grace, a lifetime of love and loss, written in the lines around her eyes. This wasn't just an old woman who'd wandered away from somewhere. This was someone's mother, someone's whole world, standing lost in the rain. I don't know where I am, she said, her voice barely audible above the traffic. I was looking for someone, but I can't remember. Daniel nodded, understanding flooding through him. He'd seen this before, though usually in the shelters or on the streets, where desperation wore different faces. But this woman didn't belong in those places. Everything about her spoke of a different kind of life, which made her presence here all the more heartbreaking. That's okay, he said, his voice steady and calm. Sometimes we all get a little turned around. Would you like to sit down somewhere dry? Maybe we can figure it out together. Scout moved forward then, not enough to crowd her, but close enough to offer his presence. The woman looked down at the dog, and something shifted in her expression. A small smile, the first Daniel had seen from her. He's beautiful, she said, reaching out tentatively to touch Scout's head. The dog accepted her touch with the gentle dignity he reserved for those who needed comfort most. I had a dog once, a long time ago. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, a recognition of pain that transcended circumstances. Here was someone else who had lost things that mattered, someone else who remembered better times through the lens of what was no longer there. Around them, the city continued its indifferent rush, but in that moment, on that corner, two souls who understood loss had found each other in the rain. Daniel crouched down beside Margaret, careful to keep his movements slow and unthreatening. Scout settled between them, his warm presence serving as a bridge between two strangers who desperately needed to trust each other. The rain continued to fall, but Daniel positioned himself to shield her from the worst of it, his weathered jacket catching droplets that would have otherwise soaked through her thin coat. Can you tell me your name? He asked gently, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had learned that rushing broken people only broke them further. Margaret's brow furrowed in concentration, her fingers worrying the strap of her handbag. "Margaret," she said finally, the word emerging like a small victory. "My name is Margaret. But there's something else. Something important I should remember." "That's good," Daniel encouraged. "Margaret's a beautiful name. What about where you live? Can you remember anything about your home?" Her eyes grew distant again, staring past him towards something only she could see. "A house," she murmured. "White shutters. There was a garden. Roses. I had so many roses, pink ones, by the kitchen window." Her voice gained strength as the memory took hold. "Michael loved to help me plant them when he was small. His hands would get so dirty, but he was so proud." "Michael," Daniel repeated. "Is he your son?" Margaret nodded, a spark of clarity flickering in her eyes. "Yes, my son. Michael builds things. Tall buildings that touch the sky. He's very important, very busy." The spark faded slightly. "Too busy to visit his mother very often." Daniel felt a familiar ache in his chest. He knew about children who grew up and away. About family that became memory rather than presence. His own daughter lived somewhere across the country now, married to a man who'd made it clear that a father with no permanent address wasn't welcome at their dinner table. Around them, the evening crowd was beginning to take notice. Daniel caught the sideways glances, saw the way people's steps slowed as they processed the scene. An old woman in obvious distress, a homeless man crouched beside her. He could read their thoughts as clearly as if they'd spoken them aloud. Some assumed he was bothering her, others that he was running some kind of con. A few pulled out their phones, though whether to call for help or to record what they expected to become an incident, Daniel couldn't tell. "Ma'am, is this man bothering you?" A woman in a business suit had stopped, her voice sharp with authority and suspicion. She held her phone at the ready, clearly prepared to dial 911 at the first sign of trouble. Margaret looked up at the woman, then back at Daniel. For a moment, her confusion deepened, as if she'd forgotten where she was or how she'd gotten there. But then, her hand found Daniel's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "No," she said with quiet dignity. "He's helping me. He's been very kind." The businesswoman's expression didn't soften. If anything, her suspicion grew deeper. "Are you sure? Sometimes people like this take advantage of." "People like what?" Daniel asked, rising slowly to his full height. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the quiet words. He'd heard this conversation too many times, knew exactly where it was heading. The woman faltered, realizing she'd been about to say something that would reveal more about her assumptions than she'd intended. "I just think maybe she needs professional help," she said, backpedaling. "Someone trained to deal with situations like this." More people had gathered now, forming a loose circle around them. Daniel could feel their judgment settling on his shoulders like a weight he'd carried for years. To them, he wasn't a man who had noticed someone in distress and stopped to help. He was a problem to be managed, a threat to be neutralized, a reminder of how quickly civilized life could unravel. "What she needs," Daniel said carefully, "is someone to listen to her and help her find her way home safely. That's all I'm trying to do." A man in an expensive overcoat stepped forward. "Maybe we should call the police," he said. "Let them sort this out properly." Margaret's grip on Daniel's arm tightened. He could feel her fear, could see the way her body tensed at the mention of authorities. He'd seen this reaction before in people whose minds weren't functioning clearly. The terror of being taken somewhere against their will, of losing the small measure of control they still possessed. "Please," Margaret whispered, looking up at Daniel with eyes that were suddenly, heartbreakingly clear. "Don't let them take me. I just want to go home." Daniel felt something shift inside him, a weight settling into place that he recognized from his construction days when he'd committed to building something that couldn't be abandoned halfway through. This wasn't just about helping a lost woman anymore. It was about protecting someone who couldn't protect herself, about standing between vulnerability and a world that had forgotten how to be gentle with its broken pieces. "There's a diner about 3 blocks from here," he said to Margaret, his voice steady despite the growing tension around them. "It's warm and dry, and they make good coffee. Would you like to go there and figure out how to get you home?" She nodded gratefully, and Daniel helped her to her feet. Scout rose as well, positioning himself protectively on Margaret's other side. The crowd watched with obvious disapproval as the unlikely trio began to walk away, but no one tried to stop them. Not yet. As they moved slowly down the sidewalk, Margaret leaning slightly on Daniel's arm for support, he could feel the weight of their stares following them. He knew this moment of relative peace wouldn't last long. Someone would call the police, if they hadn't already. Someone would decide that his presence in Margaret's life was inherently threatening, regardless of his intentions. But for now, in this moment, he had given his word to a frightened woman that he wouldn't let them take her. And Daniel Reyes, whatever else he had lost over the years, had never broken a promise to someone who needed him to keep it. The neon lights of the city blurred through the rain as they walked, 3 figures moving against the current of indifferent humanity, bound together by the simple recognition that sometimes the most profound acts of courage begin with refusing to look away. The Moonlight Diner sat wedged between a laundromat and a check-cashing store, its flickering neon sign casting uncertain light onto the rain-slicked sidewalk. It was the kind of place that existed in the margins of the city, where night shift workers grabbed coffee before their long hours, and where people with nowhere else to go could nurse a cup of coffee for hours without being asked to leave. Daniel had spent many cold nights in those red vinyl booths, grateful for the warmth and the unspoken understanding of Rita, the night waitress who had her own story of hard times and small mercies. Margaret moved slowly beside him, her steps careful and measured on the wet pavement. Scout trotted alongside them, his ears alert to every sound, every movement in their periphery. Daniel could feel the weight of responsibility settling deeper into his bones with each step. This wasn't just about getting an old woman out of the rain anymore. She had placed her trust in him with a completeness that was both humbling and terrifying. The bell above the diner door chimed as they entered, and Rita looked up from behind the counter where she was refilling sugar dispensers. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her expression shifted from casual welcome to concern as she took in the odd trio, Daniel, whom she knew well, with an elderly woman clinging to his arm and his faithful dog at their heels. "Evening, Daniel," she said carefully, her tone neutral but her eyes asking a dozen questions. "Your usual booth in the back? If you don't mind," Daniel replied, guiding Margaret toward the farthest booth from the door. The diner was nearly empty, except for a trucker at the counter and an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner booth. Still, Daniel chose the spot that offered the most privacy, the most protection from curious eyes and potential interference. Margaret slid into the booth with visible relief, her hands trembling as she placed them flat on the Formica table. Scout settled under the table at her feet, his warm presence, a comfort she seemed to draw strength from. Daniel sat across from her, his back to the wall, in a habit born of years when being surprised could mean losing what little he had. Rita approached with 2 coffee cups and a small bowl of water for Scout. "On the house," she said simply, studying Margaret with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every kind of human desperation the city could produce. "You folks need anything else?" "Just some time to talk," Daniel replied. "Thank you, Rita." As Rita retreated, Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, as if it were a lifeline. The diner's fluorescent lights revealed details that the rain and shadows had hidden, the quality of her clothes beneath the dishevelment, the expensive handbag despite its contents spilling out, the faint tan line where a wedding ring had recently been removed. "Better?" Daniel asked, gently. Margaret nodded, taking a careful sip of the coffee. "Much better." "You're very kind." She paused, studying his face across the table. "What's your name?" "I should know the name of someone who's helping me." "Daniel," he said. "And this is Scout." "Hello, Daniel." "Hello, Scout." She reached down to pat the dog's head, and Scout's tail thumped softly against the floor. I had a dog when Michael was young. A golden retriever named Honey. She was so patient with him. Let him use her as a pillow when he read his books. The memory seemed to center her, and Daniel watched as some of the confusion cleared from her eyes. Can you tell me more about Michael? About your home? Michael Island. He's successful. Very successful. Pride and sadness warred in her voice. He builds beautiful buildings, creates jobs for people. He has an office on the 40th floor, with windows that look out over the whole city. She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. But success has a price, doesn't it? He's so busy now. So important. I have caregivers, you see. Nice people who make sure I take my pills and eat my meals and don't wander off. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. You wandered off today? Margaret's laugh held no humor. I suppose I did. There was a new girl, very young, very concerned about her phone calls. I told her I wanted to walk in the garden, but we don't have a garden anymore. Haven't had one for 3 years now, since Michael moved me to the apartment in the city. Closer to everything, he said. Safer. Her voice grew smaller. But I miss my roses. The pieces were falling into place now, and Daniel began to understand the true scope of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just a lost woman. This was someone's mother who had slipped away from a life of careful management and found herself caught in the rain with memories that didn't match her current reality. The new caregiver probably doesn't even know I'm gone yet, Margaret continued. She was so busy with her personal calls. But when she finds out, fear crept back into her voice. They'll want to move me again. Somewhere more secure. Somewhere I can't cause trouble. Daniel reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his own. We won't let that happen without talking to your son first. Michael needs to know you're safe. But he also needs to understand what you need to be happy. You don't understand, Margaret said, her grip tightening on his hand. People like you. People assume the worst about people like you. If they find us together, if the police come. She trailed off, but Daniel could see the fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear for him. Outside, through the diner's rain-streaked windows, Daniel caught sight of a patrol car slowing as it passed. The officer behind the wheel was scanning the sidewalks, clearly looking for something, or someone. Scout whined softly and pressed closer to Margaret's legs, his instincts picking up on the tension that was building in the small diner. Daniel felt the familiar weight of being hunted, of being seen as guilty until proven innocent. But this time, it wasn't just about him. This time, a vulnerable woman's safety depended on his ability to navigate a system that had already decided what kind of man he was. Margaret, he said quietly, I want you to know that no matter what happens, I won't abandon you. But I need you to trust me, even if things get complicated. Can you do that? She looked into his eyes for a long moment, seeing something there that transcended the gap between their worlds. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I can. The patrol car had stopped outside now, and Daniel could see the officer speaking into his radio. Time was running out, but for the first time in years, Daniel felt he had something worth fighting for. Not just survival, but the chance to prove that dignity and loyalty weren't luxuries reserved for those who lived in tall buildings with views of the city. The patrol car moved on after what felt like an eternity, its red taillights disappearing into the river of traffic beyond the diner's windows. Daniel felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he knew it was only temporary. Word was spreading through the invisible network of concerned citizens and phone calls that kept the city's machinery of assumed protection in motion. They had time, but not much of it. Margaret had finished half her coffee and seemed steadier now, the warmth and shelter working their quiet magic. She sat straighter in the booth, and when she spoke, her words came with more clarity than they had since Daniel first approached her on that rain-soaked corner. Tell me about yourself, Daniel, she said, genuine curiosity replacing the confusion that had clouded her earlier words. You have kind eyes, but they've seen difficult things. How did you come to be? She paused, searching for words that wouldn't cause offense. How did you come to be, living as you do? It was a question Daniel rarely answered honestly. Most people who bothered to ask were either gathering ammunition for judgment or satisfying voyeuristic curiosity about how the other half lived. But something in Margaret's tone told him she was asking for different reasons, that she genuinely wanted to understand the person who had stopped to help her when no one else would. I was a carpenter, he said, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. Had my own small business, a house in Queens, a wife, a daughter. Built kitchen cabinets mostly, some custom furniture. Good work, honest work. Then, I fell off a scaffold on a job site, hurt my back pretty badly. Margaret listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that stories mattered, that the details of a life deserved to be heard and remembered. The medical bills came first, Daniel continued. Scout's warm weight against his legs providing comfort as he revisited territory he rarely explored, even in his own thoughts. Workers' comp fought everything, made me jump through hoops for months while the bills piled up. Then the pain medication when the doctors said my back would never be quite right again. Then the harder stuff, when the prescription ran out. But the pain didn't. He saw understanding dawn in Margaret's eyes, but no judgment followed it. She simply nodded, encouraging him to continue. Lost the business first, then the house. My wife tried to stick it out, but watching someone you love destroy themselves, it's harder than people think. She took our daughter and moved in with her sister in California. Can't blame her for that. It was the right thing to do. But you got clean, Margaret observed, studying his face. I can see it in your eyes. The fog is gone. Daniel smiled ruefully. 3 years now. But by then, the bridges were burned, the credit destroyed. Once you fall through the cracks in this city, it's hard to climb back out. Especially when you're carrying the kind of history that makes people nervous about giving you a second chance. Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, a gesture so natural and compassionate that it caught Daniel off guard. When was the last time someone had offered him comfort instead of asking him to provide it? You saved my life today, she said simply. Maybe I can help save yours. Before Daniel could respond to the weight of that statement, Margaret's attention was caught by something outside the window. Her eyes lit up with sudden recognition as she watched a food truck pull up to the curb, its cheerful yellow paint bright against the gray evening. Paco's Tacos, she said with delight. I remember now. There used to be one that came to my old neighborhood every Tuesday. Michael loved their fish tacos when he was in college. She turned back to Daniel with excitement. Can we go outside? I want to show you something. Daniel hesitated. Leaving the shelter of the diner felt risky with patrol cars circling. But he could see that this spark of memory was important to Margaret, was bringing her back to herself in a way that sitting still couldn't accomplish. All right, he said, standing and helping her from the booth. But we stay close. And if I say we need to go back inside, you trust me, okay? They stepped back into the evening air. The rain reduced now to a fine mist that caught the light from the street lamps. Margaret moved with more purpose than she had all day, leading Daniel and Scout toward the food truck with an energy that seemed to surprise even her. The vendor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and calloused hands, smiled as they approached. Evening, folks. What can I get you? Do you make fish tacos? Margaret asked. And when he nodded, her face brightened. 2 fish tacos, please. And whatever you have that might be good for a dog? Daniel started to protest. He couldn't let her buy food for him. But Margaret silenced him, with a look that reminded him, for just a moment, of what she must have been like in her prime. Gracious, determined, and utterly unwilling to be argued with when she'd made up her mind to be generous. As they waited for their order, Margaret hummed softly under her breath, a hymn that Daniel half remembered from his childhood. The sound seemed to create a small bubble of peace around them, transforming the busy street corner into something that felt, improbably, like sanctuary. You know, Margaret said, watching Scout's tail wag at the smell of cooking meat. I think this might be the first time I've felt truly happy in months. Not managed, not medicated, not carefully supervised. Just happy. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. A recognition that this moment, standing on a street corner, sharing a meal with a lost woman and a loyal dog, was somehow more real, more meaningful than any of the grand gestures or important meetings that filled the lives of people who lived in towers above the city. For the first time in years, Daniel felt seen not as a problem to be solved or a threat to be managed, but as a man worthy of trust, kindness, and genuine human connection. It was a gift more valuable than any meal, any shelter, any amount of money could ever be. The fish tacos were better than either of them had expected, and Scout had made quick work of the small portion of grilled chicken the vendor had kindly provided. They found a bench in a small pocket park nearby, sheltered by overhanging trees that filtered the streetlight into gentle patterns on the ground. For 20 minutes, they existed in a bubble of simple contentment, 3 souls sharing food and warmth, while the city hummed around them with its usual indifferent energy. Margaret spoke more freely now, her memories flowing with increasing clarity as the evening wore on. She told Daniel about her garden, about the morning ritual of coffee on the back porch, while she watched the roses catch the early light. She spoke of Michael as a boy, how he would build elaborate structures with his blocks, and explained to her in serious detail how each piece was essential to the whole. He was always trying to fix things, she said with a soft smile, absently stroking Scout's ears as the dog rested his head on her lap. Broken toys, wounded birds, even people sometimes. He brought home so many strays, both animal and human. I think that's what drove him to architecture eventually, this need to create spaces where people could be safe and whole. Daniel listened, understanding dawning in his mind about the kind of man Margaret's son must be. The values that had shaped him, even as success had perhaps pulled him away from simpler human connections. It made what was about to happen even more tragic. "Ma'am, step away from the homeless man, please." The voice cut through their peaceful moment like a blade. Officer Briggs stood at the edge of the small park, his hand resting on his radio. His expression set in the familiar lines of authority and suspicion that Daniel had encountered too many times to count. Behind him, a second officer waited by their patrol car, engine running, ready for whatever might unfold. Margaret's grip tightened on Daniel's arm, fear replacing the contentment that had settled over her features. Scout sensed the tension immediately, rising to his feet and positioning himself protectively between Margaret and the approaching officers. "It's all right," Daniel said quietly to Margaret, though his own heart was pounding. "Let me handle this." "Ma'am," Officer Briggs continued, his tone brooking no argument. "We've had reports of a man harassing an elderly woman in distress. I need you to come with us so we can get you the help you need." "He's not harassing me," Margaret said, her voice stronger than Daniel had heard it all evening. "He helped me. He's been nothing but kind." Officer Briggs's expression didn't change. He'd heard variations of this conversation before, had seen how vulnerable people could be manipulated into defending their manipulators. Stockholm Syndrome, the training manual called it, though he'd never bothered to understand the psychology behind the term. "Ma'am, people in your condition can sometimes be confused about situations like this," he said, his tone taking on the patronizing quality reserved for children and those deemed incapable of making their own decisions. "This man has a history with our department. Multiple arrests for loitering, trespassing, public intoxication. You need to trust us to keep you safe." Daniel felt the familiar weight of his past settling on his shoulders like chains. Every mistake, every moment of weakness, every time the system had failed him, became ammunition in the hands of those who had already decided what kind of man he was. "Those charges were from years ago," Daniel said carefully, keeping his hands visible and his voice level. "I've been clean for 3 years. I was just trying to help her get home safely." "Help her get home," Briggs repeated, skepticism dripping from every word. By taking her to some dive diner and then bringing her to this park after dark? That's not how people help lost elderly women, sir. More people had gathered now, drawn by the flashing lights of the patrol car and the drama unfolding in their quiet neighborhood. Daniel could see phones being raised, recording devices capturing what would inevitably become another viral video of police confronting a homeless man. Context stripped away, judgment rendered in the court of social media opinion. Margaret tried to stand, to place herself between Daniel and the officers, but her legs betrayed her, and she stumbled slightly. Daniel moved instinctively to steady her, and that movement was all Officer Briggs needed. "Step back from her now," Briggs commanded, his hand moving to his weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them." "Please," Margaret cried out, her voice breaking with desperation. "Don't take me from him. He's the only one who listened to me today. He's the only one who treated me like a person instead of a problem." But her words fell on deaf ears. The machinery of assumed protection was already in motion, following its predetermined script. Daniel was the threat because the system said he was the threat. Margaret was the victim because the system said she was the victim. The truth of their connection, the genuine care that had developed between them, was irrelevant in the face of policy and procedure. Scout began to bark as hands seized Daniel's arms, the dog's loyal heart unable to understand why these men in uniforms were hurting his human. Margaret's cries became more frantic as they pulled Daniel away from her, her pleas echoing off the surrounding buildings as curious onlookers whispered among themselves about what they thought they were witnessing. "Don't leave me," she sobbed, reaching toward Daniel even as other hands guided her toward the patrol car. "Please, don't leave me alone again." Daniel looked back at her over his shoulder as the handcuffs clicked into place, seeing the fear and abandonment in her eyes that he'd glimpsed when he first found her on that corner. In trying to save her, he'd given her hope, connection, dignity. Now he was being torn away from her, leaving her more lost and alone than she'd been before. The last thing he saw before they pushed him into the back of the patrol car was Scout, barking frantically as animal control officers approached with a catch-pole, and Margaret, small and fragile in the flashing lights, calling his name into the indifferent night. The holding cell smelled of disinfectant and despair, its concrete walls painted in the kind of institutional green that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at it too long. Daniel sat on the narrow metal bench, his head in his hands, listening to the sounds of the precinct beyond the bars, ringing phones, muffled conversations, the occasional burst of laughter that felt obscene in this place of broken dreams and shattered lives. He'd been processed with the efficient indifference of a system that had handled thousands like him before. Fingerprinted, photographed, searched, cataloged. The charges were familiar: harassment, public nuisance, interfering with a police investigation. The kind of charges that sounded official, but were really just legal ways of saying he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time while being the wrong kind of person. The worst part wasn't the cell or the charges or even the knowledge that his few possessions were now scattered to the wind, confiscated or lost in the chaos of his arrest. The worst part was imagining Margaret's face as they led her away, the confusion and betrayal in her eyes as the one person who had shown her kindness was torn from her side and labeled a threat. Hours passed. Daniel had no way of knowing how many. They'd taken his watch along with everything else, but the night shift had come on duty, bringing with it a different energy, a weariness that settled over the building like fog. He thought about Scout, wondered if the animal control officers had been gentle with him, wondered if anyone would think to call the shelter where Daniel sometimes volunteered, where people knew Scout's gentle nature and would treat him with the dignity he deserved. The sound of expensive shoes on linoleum drew Daniel's attention. A man in an impeccable suit was walking down the corridor, flanked by two officers and speaking in the kind of low, urgent tones that suggested authority and influence. Daniel couldn't make out the words, but he could see the deference in the officers' posture, the way they listened, with the careful attention reserved for those whose displeasure could have consequences. The man stopped in front of Daniel's cell, and for a moment, the two men studied each other through the bars. He was in his 40s, tall and lean, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of bearing that came from years of commanding boardrooms and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. His clothes probably cost more than most people made in a month, but it was his eyes that caught Daniel's attention. They held the same intelligence he'd seen in Margaret's face during her moments of clarity, the same capacity for both strength and vulnerability. "Are you Daniel?" the man asked, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone barely holding powerful emotions in check. Daniel stood slowly, aware of how he must look in his rumpled clothes, aware of the gulf that separated them in every measurable way. "Yes, I'm Michael Harrington. Margaret is my mother." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with all the weight of the night's events and the implications neither man fully understood yet. Daniel could see Margaret in her son's features now, the same bone structure, the same way of holding himself, despite the differences that circumstances had carved into their lives. "Is she all right?" Daniel asked, the question emerging from him with an urgency that surprised them both. Michael's composure cracked slightly at the genuine concern in Daniel's voice. Whatever he'd expected from this confrontation, it hadn't been worry for his mother's well-being from the man he'd been told was exploiting her. She's at the hospital now. They wanted to run some tests, make sure she wasn't hurt." Michael paused, studying Daniel's face with the same intensity he'd learned to apply to contracts and negotiations. "She won't stop asking about you. And about a dog." "Scout," Daniel said. "He's at the animal control facility, I think. He didn't do anything wrong. He was just trying to protect her when they came for us." Michael nodded slowly, filing away this information with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to gathering facts before making judgments. "The officers told me you were harassing my mother, that you took advantage of her confusion." "No," Daniel said simply. "I found her lost and scared in the rain. I tried to help her get somewhere safe so we could figure out how to get her home. That's all." "That's all," Michael repeated. But there was something in his tone that suggested he was beginning to question the narrative he'd been given. "My mother has Alzheimer's, mister." He paused, realizing he didn't know Daniel's last name. "Reyes?" Daniel supplied. "And I figured as much. My grandmother had it too, toward the end. I know what it looks like when someone's caught between past and present." Michael was quiet for a long moment, his lawyer's mind processing information and looking for inconsistencies. "The officers said you had her in some dive diner, that you were feeding her. She was hungry," Daniel said, as if that explained everything. "Which, in a way, it did. You bought her food." "She bought the food," Daniel corrected. "Fish tacos from a truck. Said they reminded her of ones you used to like in college." She was so happy when she remembered that, like finding a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. Michael's breath caught slightly. His mother had indeed loved those Tuesday visits from Paco's truck, had made a point of having fish tacos ready for him whenever he came home from Colombia, even though he'd never told her they were his favorite. How could this stranger know such a specific, intimate detail? "Unless she talked about you," Daniel continued, not noticing the shift in Michael's expression. "About how you used to help her with the roses, about how you brought home wounded birds and broken toys to fix. She's proud of you, you know. Proud of the buildings you create, the success you've earned, but she misses the garden. She misses having something to tend besides her own memories." Michael felt something crack open in his chest, a recognition that this man, this homeless stranger his mother had trusted, had learned more about what Margaret needed in a few hours than he'd discovered in months of careful management and professional care. "What did she tell you?" Michael asked quietly. Daniel met his eyes through the bars, seeing past the expensive suit to the son who was struggling to balance love and responsibility, success and connection. "She told me that sometimes the people we love most become so focused on keeping us safe that they forget we need to feel alive." The words hit Michael like a physical blow, carrying the weight of truth he'd been avoiding for months. He'd moved his mother to the city apartment for her safety, hired the best caregivers money could buy, ensured she had everything she needed, except the one thing she wanted most: the freedom to tend something growing, to feel useful and needed, instead of managed and protected. In the fluorescent-lit hallway of a police station, standing face-to-face with a man society had written off as worthless, Michael Harrington began to understand that sometimes the most profound wisdom came from the most unexpected sources. The paperwork took another hour to process, but Michael's presence had transformed the entire atmosphere at the precinct. Officers who had treated Daniel like a nuisance now spoke to him with cautious respect, the kind reserved for someone whose circumstances might be more complicated than they appeared. The charges were quietly dropped, filed under the bureaucratic euphemism of misunderstanding resolved, and Daniel found himself walking out of the building a free man, though freedom felt strange after the night's revelations. Michael waited by his car in the parking lot, a sleek black sedan that probably cost more than most people's homes. Scout sat in the back seat, his tail wagging frantically as he spotted Daniel through the window. The reunion was brief but intense, Scout leaping into Daniel's arms with the pure joy that only dogs could express, as if the hours of separation had lasted years. "I had him released an hour ago," Michael explained, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there in the holding cell. "The shelter supervisor said he's well-trained, well-behaved. Said you volunteer there sometimes." Daniel nodded, surprised that anyone had bothered to check, that anyone had cared enough to verify the character of a man they'd assumed was a threat. "When I can. Scout likes the other dogs, and some of the older ones need extra attention." Michael studied Daniel's face in the parking lot's harsh fluorescent light, seeing details he'd missed in the shadowy confines of the jail. This wasn't the face of a con man or predator. This was the face of someone who had been worn down by life, but not broken by it. Someone who had retained enough compassion to stop for a stranger in the rain. "I need to ask you something," Michael said carefully. "And I need you to tell me the truth. Did my mother give you money? Did she promise you anything in return for helping her?" The question hung between them, loaded with all the assumptions and suspicions that had led to this moment. Daniel met Michael's gaze steadily, understanding that his answer would determine not just his own future, but potentially Margaret's as well. "She tried to pay for the food," Daniel said simply. "I didn't want her to, but she insisted. Said it reminded her of taking care of you when you were young. I think she needed to feel useful again. Needed to feel like she was taking care of someone, instead of always being taken care of." Michael's throat tightened at the accuracy of that observation. He remembered his mother's frustration in recent months, her complaints about being treated like an invalid, her insistence that she was perfectly capable, even when her memory betrayed her in small but significant ways. "She wants to see you," Michael said quietly. "When they brought her to the hospital, she kept asking about Daniel and his dog. The doctor said she was more lucid than she'd been in weeks. But she wouldn't calm down until I promised to find you and make sure you were safe." The irony wasn't lost on either of them, Margaret, the one everyone assumed needed protecting, worrying about the welfare of the man who had been arrested for supposedly threatening her. "I'd like that," Daniel said. "I'd like to know she's okay." Michael opened the car door, a gesture that in any other context would have been simply polite, but in this moment felt like a bridge being built across an enormous divide. "Get in, both of you." The hospital was 20 minutes away through the city's late-night arteries, and they rode in relative silence, each man processing the evening's events in his own way. Scout sat between them in the back seat, his presence somehow making the awkwardness more bearable. His simple acceptance of the situation, a reminder that sometimes the most important connections transcended social boundaries. Margaret's room was on the 4th floor, and she was awake despite the late hour, staring out the window at the city lights below. She turned as they entered, and her face lit up with a joy so pure and genuine that both men felt their hearts constrict. "Daniel," she said, reaching out her hand toward him. And Scout, oh, you're both safe. Daniel approached her bed carefully, aware of the machines monitoring her vital signs, aware of Michael watching their interaction with intense scrutiny. But when Margaret's fingers closed around his, when she smiled at him with the same warmth she'd shown in the diner, all the institutional trappings fell away, and there were just two people who had found each other in a moment of mutual need. I was so worried, she said, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. They said you were in trouble because of me. I told them it wasn't true, that you saved me, but they wouldn't listen. I'm fine, Daniel assured her. Your son made sure of that. Margaret looked between Daniel and Michael, seeing something in her son's expression that surprised her. The rigid control was still there, the careful composure that had served him so well in business, but underneath it was something she hadn't seen in years: uncertainty, vulnerability, a willingness to question his own assumptions. Michael, she said, her voice taking on the tone of authority that mothers never quite lose, regardless of their circumstances. This man stayed with me when I was lost and frightened. He shared his food with me, listened to my stories, treated me like a person instead of a problem to be managed. Do you understand what a gift that was? Michael nodded slowly, beginning to understand not just what had happened that night, but what had been missing from his mother's carefully managed life. In trying to protect her from every possible harm, he had inadvertently protected her from every possible joy as well. I understand, he said, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel, let alone express. And I think it's time I learned how to say thank you properly.